This is going to be a very loose recording where I'm going to stumble quite a bit, I think, on getting my thoughts straight on the matter. It's a very broad and nebulous kind of set of issues that I want to talk about. I want to talk about how the words liberal and the words progressive have sort of come to align themselves with what I would consider sort of the archdemons that inhabit the world. I think let me think where to begin. So I think let me first talk about the problem of poverty. So obviously we would like a society in which poverty is progressively being eradicated or being amended, ameliorated, fixed. And the problem with poverty, as let's say an immediate emergency, is when poverty doesn't merely result in inconvenience but indignity. And perhaps when you're on the borderline between, where the threshold of the inconvenience of poverty is mounting so much that it actually starts becoming an indignity. The problem is that when people don't responsibly respond or take account of how to manage their inconvenience, they can perhaps dig themselves into a deeper trench or a deeper pit of deprivation. Perhaps because of the fearfulness around indignity. That might be a bit of an abstract way of framing it, but that's kind of the perhaps the central ground that plays into the drama of where the really demonic kind of impetuses start playing a role. So you can see this in generally poorer cultures where managing inconvenience or being accountable or responsive to managing inconvenience starts being seen as distasteful because it's a way of appeasing the system. You see, it relates to a kind of global condition or a universal state of affairs that, one has not been given a proper dispensation of dignity from some overarching, like as if there's some cosmic justice that must be meted out from the top down, sort of directly from God and not through people. So there's a worldly religion attached to this, that the world must manifest something, which to my mind evokes the description of the antichrist. And this is that spirit of antichrist where ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. So if you've heard that it should come, that the dispensation should come, and then you kind of disconnect yourself from spiritual discerning and from, let's say, the incarnated virtue of truthfulness and being responsive. There's a kind of cosmic obligation which displaces actual embodied discerning. and knowing the truth in a embodied form. So you can sort of selectively close your eyes and just rely on the cosmic obligation that ye have heard that it should come. Which, to my mind, is the polluting of the water, the salt in the water. When the salt is properly in people's blood, and that's the salt that one should contend with, and through and against, and that is the sort of the channel of manifestation. So that's quite metaphorical, but okay, let me jettison that's a bit too esoteric, but and vague as well. So, I mean, what I'm talking about, I guess, is things like rap and hip-hop. I don't want to completely throw hip-hop under the bus, because I do think that there are forms of hip-hop which are quite contemplative, and even it's in the phrase of the title, hip-hop, that there's a levity there, which I don't think is found in rap. I think all rapping in the end is essentially, it's always a bad rap at the end of the day, because when you're rapping, there's a kind of monotony, a drudgery, a defiance, which I think again is antithetical to taking responsibility. So there's a reactive component, I think, to rap, which is inescapable, and it's even so. Rap is almost malevolently or maniacally contemplative, whereas hip-hop can sort of be too frivolous. But if it's contemplative enough, there's perhaps a way through. There's a sort of a secret path there, perhaps, that there's within that genre. That there's a happy melody that can be extruded. In amidst the sort of the complexity and the chaos, and finding some kind of resonances, and that you can make a melody out of the jumble, essentially. Anyway, so what I'm trying to get at is that I think the negative aspect of hip-hop and the mostly negative contents of things like rap all essentially rests on there being a scapegoat, or there being some kind of exterior locus of control that is blamed for everything, or that there's some kind of cosmic obligation or dispensation which should manifest. There's some kind of abstract ideal which is being relied on to displace discerning and judgment and the acquisition of responsibility. So, I mean, these things can be phrased in so many different ways. I mean, you can also phrase it as in that you allow yourself to be possessed by an external motivation, that you're just reacting to the system. Now, these things have started to manifest, in liberal progressive ideology I, to even call it liberal or progressive, I think is strange. But the white monopoly capital, as it's called in South Africa, or white supremacy, as is generally regarded in the racist literature of, what do they even call it? Third wave feminism, gender studies, I don't know. However, it sort of weirdly characterizes itself. So now we're seeing, the ideology of these things be more prominent, be more conscious. And in an era which we must remember is filled with technology, which allows people to aggregate their patterns of attention seeking and attention inputs and outputs, allows them to be more conscious of their own investments, their own intellectual decision-making investments. So, I do think that it's made sense that demons are becoming more prominently visible. How they are accessed and how they are related to is much more visceral. And it's obviously a bit upsetting just how much of the world is really influenced and guided by, those sorts of ideologies of having an external locus of control and huddling together under the banner of identity and meting out just desserts, as a cosmic obligation, invoking systemic states of affairs in order to relinquish moral calculation on the level of the individual. So, therefore, also dissolving the individual into a cosmic drama of some kind. And essentially amalgamating the soul with these arch-demons. Which then allows one to channel the culture of indignity, and to revel in the indignity as a shield and a sword to perpetuate. So you get this reoccurring theme where people are essentially intoxicated in their own abuse because it solidifies their identity, or it's part of the process of perpetuating the identity in this state of irresponsibility, unaccountability, and dependence on the cosmic obligation. Now, all of this requires a scapegoat. It requires something to blame. And that feature needs to also have a kind of, this is what makes these movements fundamentally fascist, is that they all, need something like a Jewish conspiracy, like the Nazis had, where, the Jews run the world and control things behind the scenes and are, actually the masters underneath it all. Or white supremacy, it's the same worldly notion to depend on. And even now already, is it in the world? It's an open question. Is it in the world? And even now already, is it in the world? But it's being relied on not as an open question, or the open question is regarded as a closed conclusion, just out of a kind of spiritual lackadaisiness. It's a spiritual laziness, a spiritual death. These people are dead in the spirit, because they don't ask the question, even though it's technically an open question. They don't know. And this is that spirit of antichrist, where ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world. So yeah, I do think rap should burden some blame as being a kind of manifestation of a self-indulgence into the spirit of the Antichrist. It was probably sort of the first kind of real cultural formalization of a spiritual spiritually demonic genre. That sort of, people always say metal and black metal and things like that are demonic, but if anything, those are things that are just reveling directly in defiance and negative emotion. It's just sort of the crying of some kind of pain or something like that. It's, if anything, it's promoting a kind of numbness or a kind of tolerance of some kind of dearth of spirit. But rap is indulging in the reaction, is involved in elaborating the alternative to a living spirit, to, not merely, anyway, perhaps it's degrees of wrongness which are not that important to distinguish, but I do think rap is much more actively, as opposed to black metal, indulgent in the spirit of the Antichrist. mostly because this, I mean, perhaps I'm wrong, that rap, just like hip hop, can also have a contemplative thread in it that is self reflective and that's capable of, that you meditate on things. I mean, you must meditate on all spirits to know their character and to discern the spirits. And you certainly have to discern the spirit of antichrist at some point in order to have some kind of proper separation from it. You're not separated by it by ignoring it. You're separated by it by witnessing it and being able to essentially confront the enemy, or confront the opposition that the enemy creates, that the spiritual enemy produces. Let me try to universalize the topic that I want to segue into, which is talking about politics. Because locally, what's happening in politics in my country is, I always find my local politics is in the most potent form of the actual battle against identity politics, sort of in its, on the cutting edge in some sense. And so it upsets me greatly when it's sort of stuck in a kind of horrible slow motion, almost stalemate. So you can see the slow motion train wreck coming. So the problem is that the liberals haven't properly segregated themselves from the liberal progressive identity politician type people. They haven't properly branded themselves as anti, the racist ideology. They have denied it, but they haven't refuted it. They haven't really stuck their colors to the mast. So, they will not associate it with themselves, but they won't produce messages that are anti it. It's actually coming back to hurt them, because their identity, therefore, is a bit weak, and as if they're not sort of proud about who they are, or they can't be transparent or upfront about it. They don't want to make waves because the resistance that they'll get, or the arguments around it, will create perhaps bad press or something like that. It will create impressions to the middle of the road voter that doesn't understand the nuances of the culture war, something like that. They don't want to upset the people who haven't come to any deep conclusion about the culture war. That's what it feels like. It's almost analogous to I don't even want to bring up that parallel. It's only technically, it's only in terms of the numbers. It's like people who are Republican but there's a pro-Trump faction and there's an anti-Trump faction. It's like that kind of division. Not that being pro-Trump or anti-Trump on the side of the Republicans is itself an ideological sort of thing. That hasn't been cashed out in ideological terms. It is sort of grassroots populism versus more establishment-based politics as usual. So just the one is branded as being more disruptive than the other. In a context in which people regard that a system needs to be rejuvenated or shaken up quite radically in order to make any kind of real progress, or to undo the damage that's been done by the politics as usual. I mean, a lot of that is sadly just an unintended kind of consequence of the fact that people have been getting poorer since the 70s, but anyway. I don't think people would have noticed themselves getting poorer because of technology and the internet and communications technology accelerating the exchange of culture and media, which is, I think, a kind of wealth which you can't really quantify. Being able to send and receive messages through the air or through wires in the density that we're able to do that. I mean, you could only send telegraphs 100 years ago. Now you can stream voice and video. But again, that just ramps up communication, essentially. It makes communication easier, and communication is obviously some vast segment of human existence. So, if you improve human communication, you've improved the lot of humans' quality of life has been improved. So, if you're not as capable of being transported around because energy is more expensive, it's almost more. There's still more of a net gain, I guess. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit now. I need to go back to the important point that there isn't enough opposition to, the kind of the vicious concepts like white supremacy. Perhaps I'm not explaining this well enough, because I'm saying that there isn't enough opposition to the idea of systemic oppression. There isn't enough moral criticism about people who propound those kinds of vicious and fascistic ideologies that then have all this kind of reactive cultural backing, which pigeonholes people into silos of, sort of dead support for these tired narratives. What is also interesting, and I think it's worth pointing out, is that when you sort of meditate on is it in the world, just by focusing on that question and assuming the answer is yes, the cosmic obligation is present, that it should come. That focus itself seemingly creates the impression that is being assumed and focused on. It's an assumption that makes itself stronger. Which then obviously plays into this modern era of identity politics, which I've sometimes tried to reframe or label the politics of appearances. Because you can just sort of read statistics and interpret them according to your assumptions. You don't actually have to look for the actual underlying cause. You can just impute whatever the systemic historical trend that you want. You can say, well, because something was intended in history, that intention is still cosmically raining down on us. That condition is somewhat imbued in terms of a kind of reigning narrative, because it's all about orthodoxy in reality, or orthodoxy over reality. And so you don't have to interrogate reality any further than confirming whatever theory you are claiming is the hegemonic orthodoxy. And what's also interesting is they don't see the irony in having such an ideology where you have essentially a hegemonic orthodoxy that preaches about hegemony and reacting to it. They don't see the sort of the fundamental paradox in that. It really is the abyss staring into the abyss and confirming its own assumptions. So this is what makes it very hard, perhaps, to counteract narratives about white supremacy and things like that, is because you're basically fighting a worldly religion, or you're trying to dispel a worldly religion. And, people who are supposedly well-meaning and who even refer to themselves as being progressive buy into this reactivity as being the conduit of worldly salvation. I do think it's a tough problem to try to work out how to politically message around and counter, because there is a variant of this in most people's lives, in most people's thinking lives. To put it like this, some people, almost everyone, is progressive about something. They might not be progressive in the political sense, but they might be, and this is a horrible bastardization of the term progressive, um, even to begin with. But they might be progressive in the sense that they consider themselves agnostic and that they are being utterly rational and kind of responsible in all the assumptions that they make in order to hold up their agnostic worldview. There's a kind of I use the word agnostic, but to broaden it, I mean, philosophy has a lot of different avenues to go down, and a lot of different basic decisions at some point are made for people to develop a framework over their own worldview. And a lot of those decisions are sometimes people take shortcuts that are a bit haphazard, uh, and they kind of rely on that kind of progressivism, some kind of cosmic obligation where they just assume that some point is correct. But the point of that assumption is oh man, this is getting tricky because I'm going to end up repeating my whole sermon that I made in a recording some while back about the holy vanity, that there is one tenet which you kind of have to do this on, but it's kind of like is itself goes into forming the concept of good faith. You have to assume your own identity. You have to bootstrap your own entity of consciousness as a container. You have to propound essentially a distinction between an external locus of control and an internal locus of control. And if you don't have that basic distinction, if you don't have that basic category, then you can't, you don't have the material with which to even bootstrap something like responsibility. So you have to kind of assume some responsibility, and then confirm that the bootstrapping of it is good after you start doing it inductively. And then from then on forward, you're in a mixed sort of cosmic arrangement, if I can put it like that, or experience of the world. You're in a mixed a posteriori medium. in which reason and good faith and your experiences are all coextant with those basic categories. And those are something like the most necessary these are basically the tenets of a rational doctrine. That are sadly also somewhat necessary in secular life. Otherwise, you start getting pernicious self deconstructive spirals of things falling into themselves. Or falling apart into utter meaninglessness, that you don't even have the basic toolkit of having cogency anymore, of having anything be cogent of anything. So you could say, it's also the tenet of even being able to have the possibility of a teleology, of having purpose and direction, which is, of course, what the word spirit even means. The spirit of something is the heading of something. What does it lead to? What is it pointing at? Where is it going? What is it doing? And that obviously, those can be all made into meaningless questions that end up being, if you're going to inject objectivity into those questions, or you're going to say that your subjectivity on those questions is specious or arbitrary, then you've already discounted, you've basically indulged in skepticism, but also before you've established the merits of skepticism, or at least a proper weighing of how skepticism should be taken on board, which is this is getting into a very dry kind of philosophical treatise, but anyway, I'll continue it just because it might be interesting to some people. But where was I? That when I was talking earlier, I was talking about the point at which you're living in a medium where you are operating from certain basic categories. Inductively, you are inductively living with reason and rationality in a certain toolkit of with a certain toolkit of certain tenets, of basic categories, of external locus of control and internal locus of control. I mean, I emphasize these things in this way, I guess, because I do think I'm propounding sound doctrine. And so I'm showing an inroad from the most secular way that it can be expressed. But all of these things are necessary but not sufficient for good faith. You have to almost talk about good hope before you talk about good faith. And having a good hope, at the very least, has these categories intact. I don't know how to put this without it sounding radical, but in my view, faith is really quite slight. It almost is meaningless in a sense, because it's so, how do I put this? Perhaps I'm intellectually divorcing the concept of faith from charity too much, and they need to be seen as that there's a lot of faith active in charity, which I do think sort of the highest form of charity is help and justice, is in one's vision of help and justice. But then the faith that I was just talking about just now is just the concept of the continuation of that. If you've seen something been intellectually appreciated, if you've become intellectually aware of something, that you just believe in that continuation, that you believe in its subsistence, its sound subsistence. Or perhaps sound isn't even strong enough. You have to say its resounding subsistence, so that it's kind of like a seed, that it's capable of producing something that eventually produces a fruit that contains the seed again. So so faith is at some level even perhaps indistinguishable from the promises of God. which are, if you understand the Christian doctrine, which are primarily, in the woven into the two commandments which Jesus gives us, which is love God above all and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then you have the necessary conditions for the fruit of the Spirit. I say necessary because the Spirit is a living thing, so you can't really over-determine it. Well, I guess this is everything you pray in the name of Jesus. If it's in the name, it will be delivered. So that's why those two commandments, which are basically the summary of the essence and message of Jesus. Anyway, I don't want to get too religious, but there's a dynamism within the technology of Christian culture within the technology of the communion. Which permits the Spirit to I guess I can say sort of live its optimal bandwidth, live in its optimal bandwidth of, but again, all these things are, it's tough to talk about things in a kind of technical way when the whole thing is so sort of organic. Because everything is existing within the Holy Ghost, which is essentially the philosophical contemplation of how you understand God in relation to the future. And this is where a lot of contemplative, forbidden knowledge is sorry, I'm giving an overview, at least, of my doctrine, my understanding of the doctrine, which has become my doctrine. So the issue about the Holy Ghost is that There are lots of good metaphors for it, but you're supposed to live with peace, joy, and contentment within the Holy Ghost. But the Holy Ghost is also a kind of dead thing that you have to. This is where faith is very important. You have to, with faith, understand the Holy Ghost and let sleeping dogs lie, because you can't see the Holy Ghost. You can only see it with your understanding. And so when you understand what to do, which answers the question, what are you going to do about the future? You have to have an understanding about what to do. That understanding doesn't see an image of the future. It understands something about the future. And that understanding is limited by certain kinds of forbiddenness. There's certain things that are forbidden about that in that understanding. And it's let me think of the best way to explain this. I guess relative to the future, the only objects that you can track are objects of faith. And faith is essentially incredibly abstract, because there's a kind of conservation, there's a continuity about systems and subsystems and models and things like that, about what is being conserved in juggling of concepts that are being intellectually awareness is taken of those things, but the awareness of those things is it's faith is only ever, I think, so faith is like a snapshot of an intellectual arrangement, and it's a little bit deeper than a snapshot because it contains something about the dynamism, some description about the dynamism. This is getting too complicated. But the spirit is the understanding of that arrangement. Now I wish I knew some scriptural texts that talk about the way in which people are equal. Because they would shed some light onto exactly this issue that I'm trying to describe blindly without scriptural reference. This is what also causes people have the same spirit, but they don't have the same faith. And then you get the sin that is not unto death in 1 John chapter 5. And you get people rescuing each other from sin because they have a more strident and larger dynamism of faith, which they're drawing on in navigating somebody who has the same understanding but contains a different purview of objects of faith. And so then they're acting as an augmented, singular entity, where let's just say the one is acting more like the head and the other one is acting more like the hand, or the arm, or the legs that are carrying the body to walk somewhere. Faith is characterized as the feet. The feet which gives one the ability to stand and the necessary... See, the feet don't cause you to walk, but they are necessary in walking. They don't power how you walk, but they are a necessary condition. What was the main issue that I was trying to get into explaining? Something about faith. Objects of faith. Oh, it was about the Holy Ghost and the future, yes. What is the forbidden knowledge? Yeah, so I think the forbidden knowledge is something like that you can have finitude over faith. And that faith will kind of lose its dynamism into a solid structure. So a kind of loss of humility in respect to faith. I think there are even secular ways of measuring this, I guess you could call it the loss of fluid intelligence, or also in how, hopefully I'm talking about something which hasn't been a fabricated lab experiment or something like that, or it turns out that it does have merit, but because obviously I don't know the rigor of the science, but when cognitive functions were being mapped out in PET scans, they discerned the pattern of introverted intuition, which is sort of that the brain seemingly stops to think and then it lights up randomly in different places, making new connections from quite distant clusters of I guess structures of pattern. So it's sort of like the potential universal glue that is an activity that has to be actually tested. I'm calling something glue that has to be tested. That's a bit of a mixed metaphor. So I guess what I could call it, another way of calling this humility, is I guess summarizing all of this, you could summarize it as, what is justice? Recontemplating or reconsidering the question of what is justice, what is helpful. So you could call it sort of being updated in one's proactive good hope in terms of how you are contending in your understanding of a situation. And, one can imagine that some people are better than this than others because they track more things or something like that, or they have more knowledge, but I would say that they're only viably able to communicate with each other if they already have the same quality of understanding. But they might differ in terms of their objects of faith that they're tracking. And I think that this is completely poisoned if you have a reactive cosmic obligation that you're relying on, that you're dependent on, that you would be leaning on your understanding to assume past an open question. Which then atrophies one in terms of being able to atrophies one to the point of spiritual death, because you wouldn't have the scope to even reconsider something that you're assuming. It's kind of like permanent blindness, permanent darkness. And that's the kind of awareness of darkness that one has to be aware of in order to actually have an understanding, as opposed to a non-understanding. And so you can see, how defiant people are in terms of being filled in specificity, so that they can continue to rely on their generality of assumed narrative, a symbol of life rather than contending with real life. And when one is working with those symbols, that's a better way of putting it, rather than saying that the forbidden knowledge of the Holy Ghost is an image of the future. It's better to call it a symbol of the future. Although, I think it's a better way of constructing that. So I made a long recording, which I might have already uploaded just before this one, which I'm a bit embarrassed to upload because it gets so long for me to think out the answers to certain questions that I've explored in recordings a long time ago. It's funny how I often get to the same question or the same quandary, and it takes me a while to sort of talk my way out of it. But when I do so, I'm also recalculating the moral logic, because it's not at the forefront of my mind, because it is a kind of deep matter that is actually worth it to keep updated on, because it does give you a kind of different vista from which to grapple with, or grapple life through that context, or that framework rather. Anyway, I want to talk about a few things that sort of are connected to some of the subjects that I went over there, which is in that last recording. So, the social justice warrior mentality at its fundamental core, I think, is a bit of atomized logic, which is, I think I correctly diagnosed in the last recording, an antichrist worldly religion. But just taking it from its own structure, I'm going to expound on that from looking at its own internal thinking. So it's an atomized logic that holds one thing sacred, and that is that the atomized individual should get to decide what the identity should be, or what do you want your identity to be as, or something like that. And if there's anything obstructing your choice, this, you see, it's more than that. It's more than just the atomized individual deciding what the identity should have included in it. It's the kind of cosmic joining in of everybody else into the same project, that identity should be that easy, that identity should be that open and accessible to everyone as well. And so, and my proof of that being the true structure of their thinking, of their religion, of it's not just an atomized religion, it's not just an atomized individual, it's an atomized individual with a kind of way of overcoming the problem of cosmic luck or fatalism is that everyone should be equally morally bound into solving this problem, that the atomized individual should just be free to include whatever they want in their identity. And with that guarantee, you solve the unconscious side of the mind, essentially. Because then objectively you have a moral framework which can hold things in view. And the kinds of things that it holds in view, therefore, is this kind of strange objectivity that it basically it defines objectivity by its opposite, arbitrariness. That if anything is an arbitrary imposition against the atomized individual's choice of what to include in their identity, then it's objectively a moral evil. And so objective facts and objective impositions, which are you see, the strange thing is that, these impositions against the individual are described as basically statistical pressures that are felt by groups or groupings of atomized individuals. So, you see, this is why I think that, sort of looking at these kinds of statistical facts are themselves, they're not respected as they don't have a quantum signature. They are themselves a kind of an illusion. And the drama of fighting with them is itself only possible if you kind of perform some kind of strange, erroneous style of thinking where you equate the past and the present. So you get over the fact that you're not only dealing with something that is not actually necessarily against the individual, but it's against a group, and it's a statistic. So it's even 2 steps removed away from reality. I should have tried to elaborate this better from their point of view. I'm already too far into the debunking it mode to do it justice from their perspective. Suffice to say is their collective purpose of everyone having the same kind of moral sentiment is a substitute for having a kind of religious rigor in the self. It quashes all questions of responsibility, because you're only responsible for this one tenet, that the atomized individual should be able to decide what is to be included in their identity. And if they aren't able to freely decide that, then what is stopping them from freely deciding that is is evil and wrong and should be opposed. What I've always thought is, to try to play their game in such a way that unravels it is say, okay, well, I identify as a realist, and the definition of a realist is someone who is a responsible decider over what is considered real or objective. But someone like that who is imposing real features from the world would then just be labeled as an oppressor fundamentally, because then they would describe features that would give explanation to why someone's limitation of their choice over identity would not just be an arbitrary imposition, but would be a reasoned imposition, a justifiable imposition, an orderly imposition. There are many reasons. For example, let me just exemplify some of this just to make it more tangible. There are reasons why this is the kind of thing that it's very hard to just manifest this offhand, but I can probably come up with a half-decent example. So, as an example, everything in this world that you might wish to diminish comes at a cost. So if you want to sort of diminish the burden of having irresponsible parents, I have to try to think of a good enough sort of tangible example, then you've basically created a society in which you must make parenting obsolete. Or at least come up with a substitute for parenting that makes the role of parents it eventually turns out, into this logic of having as your ultimate aim that atomized individuals should be able to choose their own identity. It ends up being the same kind of thinking and equation of equality of outcome. It ends up in that same camp. Also because the atomized individual can arbitrarily make war with real features. There will never be you really have to go to war with the nature of reality itself to make any real progress. This is getting a bit too ephemeral even for myself. I'm not following or I'm not explaining the thread perhaps well enough. But these issues trigger the fear surrounding fatalism and cosmic luck. That if there isn't a kind of insurance for respite from the ravages of, the slings and arrows of misfortune, that you can extract from any and everyone else. Basically, any pragmatic dynamic can be warred against. You can make war on any pragmatic dynamic as an atomized individual. And if there's no rudimentary uniformity that can be found between individuals, I guess perhaps that's where the statistical groupings offering a kind of objective dynamic then has to be clung to in order to offer some kind of mediating fabric, which in the meantime also means that people can be bogged down in the dramatization of, that their imagination for being able to choose their own identity is limited by the arbitrary impositions cast against their grouping. Anyway, going round and around and repeating myself basically, but I would just point again that the arbitrary nature of these impositions, as they are attached to statistical groupings, essentially, or groupings in a way that create statistical facts, in inverted commas, I think that, this is the drama that is the inevitable consequence of starting from the premise of an atomized individual. With a sanctity around open access for that atomized individual to make choices as regarding their identity. So there's a kind of sanctimoniousness. And that sanctimoniousness is not tempered by responsibility, is not tempered by anything. It's just given an ultimate kind of position. And because it's not regulated or mediated by anything that can even create a universalism of reasoned beings or anything like that, which is the kind of, at least the secular platform upon which you start to have real religion, with dealing with everyone as an equal entity, but not as an unlimited equal entity, because that's like self-contradiction. So, for example, if people don't burden a requisite amount of responsibility over reality, by definition, you need to be able to label some people as being insane or mad. I mean, and this is really, well, this feature of insanity, I think, is a proper feature that comes. I'm just trying to think how to make it slightly more generic. Perhaps there is I can abstract it slightly to find a more essential qualia. But I think that would just be madness, or insanity is just the polar opposite of pragmatism. So someone who's not able to be pragmatic, you would call insane or mad. Someone who's not able to deal in pragmatism because they don't share the same reality, because there are limitations. In our equality, there are limitations. Anyway, I feel like I've laid down all the puzzle pieces requisite to make sense out of a lot of these messy issues. I should say as well, this is a decent segue into just me talking about some of my theory that I've been thinking about recently. So I think people forget that the ego, and I'm talking about my elements of my metatype structure. That the ego is anchored in the unconscious, and so the state of the unconscious, any holdover that the unconscious has, is going to really set. There's baggage, there's real unconscious baggage, which, especially in the inferior function of the unconscious, and the juxtaposition between the inferior function and the dominant function of the unconscious. That's where the baggage is going to transfer from the unconscious into. So the tension between the unconscious dominant function and unconscious inferior function, and then that inferior function is the foundation of the ego. So I think that that hook that's left over kind of shrouds the ego. What else should I say? So I do think the social justice warriors, because they're unconscious, get sort of half-baked in this antichrist kind of religion. I think that their ego is operating, but I think that they're actually fundamentally subconsciously driven. They're able to stay channeled in their subconscious and unconscious. So their subconscious-unconscious connection, where the unconscious emanates from the subconscious in the same way that the ego emanates from the unconscious. They can at least obscure and avoid, let's say, the work of maturity and developing properly, because they never channel their ego in a proper way, in a way in which they're trying to resolve the unconscious and the ego. Instead, they're still fumbling and toying with the subconscious and the unconscious. Because there is an actual hope that the unconscious will find resolution by the subconscious input into it, into this kind of cosmic collective religion. And so the seat of consciousness is kind of in the unconscious, but that's not even really possible. So the subconscious is overcharged. And this is why there is this obsession into a kind of fractal identity and fractal decision making, because that's all the subconscious does, is it just gives you options of kind of eclectic composition. And so they can only sort of resentfully channel their ego as their ego is curating and eventually seeing the end of the compilation of these eclectic compositions, or some kind of, anyway, it's not that interesting to even think about, but anyway, just as a social commentator, so to put it another way, their unconscious itself is obsessed with their subconscious. You really need an unconscious that objectively believes in what it's doing, in a way that affirms the self, in a kind of responsibilism, in an epistemic responsibilism, in order to give the ego the impetus and the charge and the seat of consciousness, so that the ego can even delve into itself and go as deep as the superego, and perhaps bridge between the ego and the superego. I believe I did that recently. When I say recently, about half a year ago. It's very hard to move the superego. Just trying to think about how to formulate talking about it. I guess the only way for the ego to move the superego is for death to occur. I mean, ego death. So there's something like an implicit ego death being managed, as the ego is really the managerial executive function between the four sides of the mind. And that must also mean that there is for that ego death to be really permitted, it has to be both consonant with the unconscious, but also consonant with the unconscious charge or impetus that creates a kind of independent ego. I want to say more than independence. Just trying to think of a better way to describe it. Well, I think at some point the ego has to encapsulate an independent mirroring of the unconscious charge. It has to have a parallel key to the unconscious's seal. So yeah, the unconscious is sort of sealed. Almost the overarching slogan of the unconscious is, what are you doing objectively? And if the ego doesn't have an answer to that question, it doesn't have a key to break the unconscious seal, and then it's stuck in the kind of subconscious, unconscious fog that the seat of consciousness is going to be stolen from the ego and handed to the subconscious to sort of meld a kind of fatalism or cosmic luck in the eclectic compilation of what identity kind of emerges from the slurry of what the fabric, or what's already been written on the subconscious fabric, which is it's just like a set of tablets that can be churned around, or sort of has its own astrology, or like a procession of, anyway. I don't want to explain that metaphor. It's going to derail me too much. But I've spoken on that when I've talked about the subconscious and other recordings. So what's my point? So the ego's independent sense of what it is doing, that is manifest as a kind of responsibilism that it's actively pursuing, gives it a kind of I was trying to think of a better word, but let me just say immunity to the subconscious fog. It still has to actively put its hand into the subconscious and direct from a pool of choices which it might not be happy being confined to. So it's stuck in a kind of subconscious pragmatism. That's a better word than just calling it immunity. So it's stuck with the subconscious pragmatism. And if it really wants to mix things up, it has to, for lack of a better word, it has to fuck with the superego and kill it, and in so doing, it has to at the very least risk killing itself, and eventually if it actually does want to change the pool in the subconscious, it has to go through an ego death. But it's capable of doing that because it has a kind of eternal life. Because it's already been worked out between the unconscious and the ego. So it's always going to be a seed from the same fruit, from the same tree. So the ego would be the tree. So the subconscious will be the fruit, and the unconscious will be the seed. Don't know if that's a good projection. Yeah, because the unconscious sort of plants the seed to grow a new tree. Actually, I do like that projection. Because the subconscious, I think, is like the fruit, because that's the sort of the flesh of the thing that actually is the contents. And if the ego is constantly thinking and discerning and speaking the seed, the word, the unconscious, what it is actually doing, there's a kind of lockstep parallel between the ego and the unconscious, but that's independently held by the ego, but it's paralleled between the tree and the seed anyway. So if the tree wants new fruit, it has to live with the fact that it might displace itself with a new tree, essentially, but it's the same tree or it's in the same lineage. Anyway. Perhaps it's a bit too strained for people to follow, but anyway. The thing that isn't even spoken of there is the superego. which is the thing that precedes the subconscious and precedes the ego. You see, the superego is just the natural consequence of the ego, though. And the foundation of the superego is the sin of the ego. Perhaps I must try to come up with a more generic term than sin. Let's see if I could call it the state of sin. I guess it's either the sin or knowing the truth. So the ego's knowledge of the truth or sin is the foundation of the superego. I think that ties things up quite nicely. So I moved on into some unifying theory. Yeah, and I think that the knowledge of the truth must include a lot of sort of self-knowledge, being able to deal in the tensions between the sides of the mind and diagnosing, sort of from the philosophical in context to the particular metatype. Hmm. Well, I think that's everything I was thinking about. Man, it's been a while since I can remember imbibing Game B discussions and conversations and things like that. Usually, when I get up to date with, sort of, or feeling the pulse of what's ever going on there, I can quite quickly remember my critique of Game B, which is not at the forefront of my mind at the moment. But instead of focusing on a critique of Game B, I'm just going to critique American political consciousness to some degree and segue that into what the real solution to Game B is and how Game B is not being solved. I see Game B as being a symptom of the same, another symptom, the quandary that the Game B people find themselves in, sort of trying to define or trying to structure a new culture, a new rubric, or new systems and things like that. Where they are trying to create a kind of private, when I say private, I mean like not a statist structure, but a decentralized private impetus on, I'm even talking about things that maybe some would disagree with in their quarters, but let me just critique the American consciousness, because I think that, as I've already said, the problem, the circular kind of problem chasing in Game B centers around that. So let me just say that the American consciousness, which is informed by their structure of their form of government, really deserves the culture war. And the solution to the culture war is that a judge at some point tells a social justice warrior, no, you're not going to get your way, because what you're trying to do is just, it goes against basic principles, it goes against basic common sense, it goes against the structure of the legal theory. But America doesn't have a legal theory like that, because the legal theory in America is a product of politics. The law in America is a democratic function that gets fought over. It's like a food fight. So America fundamentally cannot have the rule of law, ever, in terms of how it's structured in its legal theory. Because the law is itself a product of politics. So democracy is the king in America, above the judge. And so no one knows what the law tomorrow will be, because it can change on the democratic whim. So, the sort of, the republic is superseded by the democracy. The content of the law in the republic is superseded by the democracy. And all the republic does, one of the biggest features of the structure of the republic, the constitution of the republic, gives the democracy this sovereign power, essentially. So, what's the point of having a republic when it already subordinates itself automatically, and it subordinates law automatically to the democracy? So you have the rule of man, you have the rule of the democracy defining what law is. So there is a fundamental disrespect for what law intrinsically is in the American system, in the American psyche. It makes all Americans essentially kind of sort of trollish also. Because, obviously Americans can appreciate law and order. There's a great sort of vague grey area as to what the integrity of the contents of the law that is imposing an order, can be, is varied. It's not principled and stable and set down in stone, where the principles are fixed and the law is static. You need to have a static law to have the rule of law. You need to have a complete law. But in America, the system of law is always incomplete and always in political play. So justice is kind of vacuous or empty or unfinished. The concept of justice, again, is subordinated by a political function. Now, if you're some kind of pragmatist, I guess you can kind of get away with that. That that the law is slowly doing inductive tests, and this way of structuring your legal theory does mean that the civil law in America is more vibrant and is more dynamic. There's more dynamism in it. And this makes culture more alive, so the sort of the political, the structure that law would otherwise impose over people's thinking is instead a kind of food fight that allows for pursuing a matter or an issue and ventilating it. So, the American system is like a kind of hotbed of pontificating around what the law might be or should be in a kind of political, through a political vehicle. So, this is why America deserves the culture war. Because its legal theory isn't strong enough to say the culture war is stupid. Because essentially the debate is always open in America. And it doesn't have the function to close the debate. That even stupid debates, as long as they're popular, as long as there's democratic, sort of a democratic mandate behind it, if enough people think that the issue is in play and that the issue needs to be ventilated, it can arrest the whole of society. Now, there is a de facto rationale that that this means that the political system isn't allowed, and the legal theory isn't allowed to be too good for the people. So the culture and the politics and the law is all sort of within earshot of each other. And so this makes the American culture very watery, and I mean that in the biblical sense of the water. The water, everything is misty, everything is mysterious in the sense of that it's thick with implication of a lesson to be learnt by the electorate. So like what is on the mind of the electorate is dreamt about by sorry, I'm trying to spiritualize the secular beastly mechanism. But essentially, whenever you have a king and democracy is the king in America, you'll always be haunted and in fact cursed by a spiritual question. And that spiritual question is quite plainly stated as, is the king one of the prophets? Is democracy a prophet of God? And so when you have that haunting expectation that is infused in your political milieu and your political environment, you have a kind of atmosphere which becomes kind of thick with mist, and and obviously that also creates friction and thunder and lightning, I guess, in some places. So there's a lot of atmospheric thickness and weather. Anyway, I'm trying to, perhaps this metaphor is too all over the place, but America is ventilating its cultural state of readiness, and so America becomes a beacon, a cultural beacon for the world, because this is the state of what is going on in people's minds. This is why I think the American psyche captures so much of the world's attention, because they are collectively suffering for their zeitgeist in a in a kind of collective pathos that is being doled out as a political play. Anyway, I'm repeating myself in a different way. Okay, so now, I do think that this breeds a kind of cynicism, but this all happens, we must not forget, by displacing the rule of law, which is what makes the system particularly overly spiritualized, because you have to ask, well, is there where is this democracy taking us? Where is it collectively taking us on a spiritual collective? And so you turn the electorate into a kind of secular collective church, which is, in my view, a very antichrist kind of spiritual structure, because you have a kind of collective destiny then being evoked. And for the reasons of my last recordings, that's also, problematic. But anyway, what's the other points to be raised on this issue? So yeah, there is a problem when you have a kind of collective fatalism or a kind of cosmic luck, which you are investing in this kind of collective destiny with in some grand project that's bigger than yourself, that you are sort of just a part of. Whereas if you have the rule of law, then you don't go looking for God in the collective anymore. You can actually do a proper spiritual search, because you know that it's not, that there's nothing spiritual about these things. So I prefer a secular structure to be completely removed from questions of religion. Anyway, that's probably not the thing that I should be harping on about at the moment. But there are other good reasons to prefer that arrangement. Because already, the antichrist sentiment is already let's say, the general slide that people will naturally gravitate towards anyway. And so you want to have a structure that obviates it. Otherwise you're creating vessels of worldly power, dressed in a kind of viable antichrist mechanism. That there is actually, that democracy as a king is one of the prophets, that you're holding out hope for that. And so then you don't have to develop the spirit of the prophet, or look for the real spirit of the prophet, the real gift of prophecy. You don't have to be spiritually engaged in that, because you're already collectively occupied. So there's no room for a kind of Christ consciousness or for a spiritual development and understanding, because you're already part of a kind of collective church destiny sort of thing. Anyway, so this is the American mediocrity, which I think is which I've already described as a kind of center stage in the world of culture. And I don't want to be too harsh on America, because this does have a way of sort of capturing Satan and pinning it down into, this is the great snake that you often see in the Orthodox, the lineage of how Satan has evolved and things like that. As an element of kind of culture, and I'm just explaining it and describing it or describing its signature as it applies to the polity in America. Obviously other countries don't have a polity structured in the same way. And so, Satan, if it is going to be, or let me say, the spirit of the Antichrist is going to have to manifest in culture by itself, without involvement. It'll have to purely establish itself in culture. It'll have to establish itself as a subculture, like as a group of people. But you see, it's then it will have to set itself out as a real cult, as a real, as a real church. It'll actually know itself to be in the field of religion, or think itself to be in the field of a true religion, but it's actually just an antichrist version. That it's selling some narrative about some kind of collective destiny or something like that. Or, waiting for something to happen. Instead of doing the work of, it's amazing how quickly you can dispel a lot of Christian rhetoric, or so-called Christian rhetoric, that exists, just with some verses in the King James. It says quite clearly that you have to achieve the full stature of Christ in Ephesians chapter 4. That you won't be blown about by the winds of doctrine, the winds of false doctrine. And that there's one understanding of the doctrine, as what's described in Ephesians chapter 4. Anyway, obviously, sorry, I'm meant to be focusing on politics, and I'm talking about the scripture. Anyway, I have already gone into these concepts, and there's kind of psychological patterns. Okay, wait. So, yeah, so the social justice warrior stuff, I think, is the perfect plague for America to be riddled by. And the American political structure doesn't have to change so long as a majority of people garner enough sort of spiritual education to discern exactly what is wrong with these people and keep on sending politicians to defend against them. So a kind of eternal, this is going to be a kind of eternal American cultural war that vigilance will never have to end against it, as it's still developing. There is the proper handle on how to respond to the culture war in America in terms of the state and politics. But it is a kind of something that has to be defended against, and the only sort of vehicle that you have in America, because you can't just have stable law that's static, or because America doesn't have stable law that's static, the politician has to constantly defend against it. And that makes the whole system look feeble to my mind. That's the great flaw in the American system, is that when you actually are faced with your arch nemesis or shadow or enemy, like fundamental antithesis, the social justice warrior, the shadow of the American system. These social justice warriors are really the sons and daughters of liberty in America, the kind of liberty, the kind of political liberty that America has enjoyed. This is the chickens come home to roost. Because American judges are basically just secretaries to the democracy. They just follow whatever the plenary power has already delivered in terms of its content. The plenary power of sorry, I don't know what the generic word is. I would say parliament, but there is no parliament in America. Congress. The plenary power of the Congresses. Of the congressional will. See, that's the thing. When you have a system that is fundamentally underpinned by congressional will, political will, in the American system, congressional will wields the plenary power. And law itself does not... the Constitution is above it, but the Constitution says that plenary power is sovereign, essentially. To even have the power to amend the Constitution. Technically, that's not true. There is also the Senate that has to confirm. But the Senate is actually just the representation of the state congresses, is it not? Or no, it's the state senate. I'm not sure what it was originally, at least. I don't know what the fundamental difference between the Senate and the Congress is. I mean, the terms were different. I'm just trying to remember in the Federalist writings what the fundamental... Did they have different pools of the electorate originally? I can't even remember. How is there... There's almost just a kind of arbitrary, traditional bifurcation of some kind of function. I guess it's just one way to convolute the plenary power to have it to have some internal friction so that it checks up on itself, because it is the most unbridled power. So it's just a way to kind of... Anyway. This is all irrelevant, so I'm getting into the weeds of something that's not really relevant to my main point. Where was I? So I was talking about the rule of law. I was talking about the culture war, the American psyche being fundamentally invested in a kind of sort of adulterous spiritual love affair with a kind of collective destiny of some kind of fudging a moral question. Because it allows itself to leave the law unfinished. And therefore always escape having the rule of law. I mean, a judge, relative to the judge has their hands bound by the current state of the law, but politically it's in flux. A new Congress, the political function can supersede, the political function can pardon and create special dispensations. And novate whole look, I don't want to get into the nuts and bolts because, I mean, obviously law is a complicated subject and things do change and you need to have a legal system that's capable of adapting itself. But let me just say that you can have a system that does have a static law. The expression of the law might evolve, but the principles can stay static. There can be a stable, solid canon of values and principles and constitution. I mean, this is the problem with the American Constitution, is that it's absolute and it doesn't have a limitations clause, which actually makes the American Constitution very weak, not very strong, because that means that every time your constitutional rights are infringed, they are just defined as not being infringed, because you have an absolute right to that thing. So you can't say, I don't want to pay my taxes because it's an infringement of my right to pursue happiness. So you see just how everything gets just definitionally gets whittled away. It's ridiculous, rather than saying, no, your right to happiness can be infringed by other competing valid interests or legal being able to argue over the mitigating measure at least gives you a scope to counteract the politician's gerrymander of the legal principle. And yes, I mean, there can be certain times in which legal controversies, difficult legal issues and questions, can be confused. That certain issues are just not ripe for clear and decisive resolution. And this can often be reflected in appeals and judgments that, go into ratio decidendi, that, sort of labor into mitigating and, sometimes there can be a kind of philosophical quandary, which might be the wrong quandary or the wrong framework, because someone hasn't innovated broad enough use of more principles into a legal issue or a legal question. I mean, sometimes this is also a product of the facts of the cases themselves, is that people get themselves into controversies which are just fundamentally unwieldy to finding a reconciliation about, because there's a distance there's too much of a vague distance between the pragmatism utilized by the parties and the already established development of, let's say, reasonable man criteria, duties which are expected, that people are expected to act, in accordance or abeyance with. But anyway, so I'm getting into the weeds here. That's the wonderful. I mean, there is something. There's a beautiful product in the law in South Africa that I don't think is properly described. But when hard legal questions are finally resolved, it's like a point of information gets broadcast within the common law, that people in a certain kind of dispute, in a certain kind of practice, are set against certain expectations. And that becomes a kind of practical principle that certain potential controversies are framed by a split of duties between the parties. That side of the issue, people on that side of the issue are saddled with these duties, and people on this side of the issue are saddled with these other duties or expectations. And it creates a framework in which there's a very clear and orderly expectation as to when someone fails in their duties, what the remedy will be. And so you end up creating rights in that circumstance. You create common law rights naturally from this process, not by the invention of the politician, but that the judge is actually capable of developing these common law rights. And it can be sped along by a parliament, by a plenary power, who takes, that opens their ear to listening to what's going on in the courts, so they can kind of take a proactive approach. But they can also misstep and get it wrong and be corrected by the courts. You see, in my legal system, the judges are actually above Parliament. The judges are above Congress and the Senate. The High Court judges, not the Supreme Court judges, the High Court judges are above Parliament. And so when you're sitting before a judge and you can make your case, you can appeal to reason. You don't have to appeal to, you can appeal to reasonableness and use reasoning fully. You don't have to be saddled within the confines of some political invention or innovation. The question of unlawfulness becomes a more important question than mere illegality created by contravening statutes. I mean, that's the power of being before a judge in a high court. Is that illegality does not automatically translate into unlawfulness. America has a taste of this, but it's really in the wrong place. It's sort of like, that jury nullification can occur. In my legal system, the judge has a deeper and more integrated function that actually leaves the law in a better state and works on the whole law as a unified whole, as it were. So that everyone enjoys the development of justice and an extrapolating theory of justice. As a process of sort of unified introverted feeling or understanding. Sorry, I shouldn't have snuck that in, referring to dimension 2, anyway, of my cognitive function theory, but like if you have a constitution which is founded in first principles, then you are properly liberated when you go to court, because you can get the judge to do, the judge is also a banker, is also a, and I can't remember all the natural powers that the judge has. But the universal jurisdiction over substantive matters and substantive that they can hear any matter and provide remedy if it's, if there is provision for that remedy within the law. Now, this obviously isn't the solution to everything, but being able to have a way to solve conflicts when there's a breakdown of negotiation between the parties. When there's a force of imposition that obviously is collectivized within the state. It just means that you can live in a free society and be protected from things that you shouldn't have to politically fight. Because, the problem with social justice warriors is that they really offend the liberal order. They get involved in a liberal intolerance paradox. They are the avatar of the liberal intolerance paradox, in fact. And the more you try to actually engage them instead of just sort of legally protecting yourselves from them and legally obviating them from, because, they should be ejected from institutions. The state should be able to protect itself against their ideology. But the state isn't in the American, as far as people are in the image of the American legal system, there's no way to overcome the liberal intolerance paradox. The people themselves have to keep on choosing it and have to themselves keep on voting against it, essentially. Whereas if you have a law that is developed with certain values, like the value of non-racialism and non-sexism and all those sorts of things, then you can just say, no, you people are racists, you so-called social justice warriors, you've just failed. You're not allowed to do this in society, it's unconstitutional. So you can have these views privately, but, we don't much like you talking about it openly and publicly, because that's essentially anti-constitutional propaganda, and you're trying to undermine the Constitution, and that's actually what hate speech really is. I would even define hate speech as being hate speech or anti-constitutional propaganda. I wrote a hate speech bill that goes deeply into formulating where all the lines of this kind of stuff are. But I even think political parties that try to undermine the Constitution in this way, anti-constitutional propaganda, they should be ejected from Parliament. They can still have their civil, indemnity, where they can't be held civilly liable for what they're doing with their speech. But that, and if people want to vote for parties like that, then those seats can be empty in Parliament, and so they're effectively voting no on everything because they've been ejected from the House. But the Speaker should, anyway, that's a side issue. But, you have to take the liberal intolerance paradox seriously. There has to be some kind of solution for Hitler and the Weimar Republic. The problem of Hitler existing within the Weimar Republic. You can't have democracies so weak that they're incapable of protecting themselves and staying liberal democracies. And I mean, obviously, classically liberal. And, it's fine for these people to scream when, or to make a big stink because they're being ejected, and then they can cry foul, and they can cry, oh, this is fascist, or something like that, or this is totalitarian, or this is a dictatorship again, but I mean, they are the ones who are obviously promoting a dictatorship style of government. And so they can make their cries as a radical being ejected from the House. And effectively, if a majority of seats are empty in the House, then obviously the House can't do its business. Then you can say the system has been democratically vetoed. Because I would still count their total as being members of the House. They're just empty seats. So they're effectively always voting no for every bill that the House would put forward. So the system can democratically invalidate itself if it is being democratically vetoed. Obviously you can't impose a constitution on a society, on a population that simply doesn't endorse it. That would be undemocratic. But, the most important thing about society is not that it is a democracy, but that it is a liberal democracy. And supreme constitutions should not waste their supremacy on just dignifying the democracy at the cost of integrity. Democracy is not a force, is not an absolute force for good. This is just obvious. If you're not going to use a constitution to entrench a liberal democracy, then, what is the... what do you even have that's worth preserving? So as I've already stated, the preservation of such can be invalidated by democracy. And I've already stated, the numbers that would result in such that, you would still have to be able to pass bills in under the pressure of the empty seats. If there ever is such a, if quashing, so I mean, obviously you have to win the moral argument. You have to do a bit of as the Speaker of the House, when you are ejecting these people that are violating the intolerance paradox, you have to win the moral argument, and you have to state your moral argument. I mean, I know exactly what I would say to people like Julius Malema as Speaker of the House. You say, you're obviously a non-racialist based on your statements. You swore an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution. You are in breach of your oath. Do you deny that you're not a non-racialist? And then he might say, I don't deny anything. I don't have to deny anything to you, or he'll make some kind of grandstanding thing. And then I'll just say, I'm calling in people to remove you from the House because you're a racialist. And you won't deny that you're a racialist, because you are in fact a racialist. And we're not going to suffer through that unconstitutional damage. We're not going to suffer through those constitutional damages by having racialists in the House. We're not going to give you extra time and a platform to spew your anti-constitutional propaganda, your racialist propaganda. It's that simple. You have failed or lied in the upholding of your oath. It's effectively a crime of dishonesty. Constitutional damages in that context. I mean, I'll concede that it's a kind of political dishonesty. But anyway, we can't pretend to uphold the Constitution while blatantly being its antithesis. You have to uphold all of the Constitution. You can't just pick and choose. I'm sure that they might make us think that they're focusing on the justice for other people, and so no, you don't get to be exclusionary in that sense. You have to uphold all of the Constitution, all of the fundamental parts of it. I mean, it's a foundational value, non-racialism. I mean, you can just read the limitations clause. The conduct is unjustifiable. Anyway, it's not justified to continue to tolerate that stuff. And then you actually have a strong shield against so-called social justice warriors. And you have the means to eject them and such from institutional... because, I mean, they kind of have this sort of... It's almost like plagiarism, where they talk out of both sides of their mouth. They... confuse moral language and things like that. And they play these silly word games and such. I mean, yeah, you just have to make the point that I'm charging you with constitutional damages. I'm charging you with failing to uphold your oath because you are a racialist and you're not upholding the value of non-racialism. Do you deny it? And then there's just some kind of obfuscation or some kind of strange grandstanding that happens, and it's you have not answered the charge, or how you have answered the charge is patently dishonest. Goodbye, I'm removing you. It's really that simple. You just stand on principle. And you can say, you can agitate for political support, but you cannot make pronouncements of anti-constitutional propaganda, and you cannot make pronouncements of unlawfulness of the speaker's conduct in protecting the Constitution from constitutional damages. You can probably submit to slander if he wants to make just slanderous remarks or something like that, but obviously you can't incite violence against the speaker. So what I've just stated would be the lines and the limits. Sorry, you can see I'm quite invested in this imagined showdown between the Speaker of the House and Julius Malema. Obviously, it'll never happen in the current state of constitutional betrayal that we sit with in South Africa, which has the only functioning constitution in the world that actually on paper is capable of being resilient to the so-called social justice warrior fascism and the unprincipled, sort of confounding of common sense and reasonableness and confounding of basic principles and values like non-racialism and fairness. It's really strange how social justice has come to mean its antithesis when social justice is actually mentioned in the Constitution, which we must remember, social justice is literally a term coined by Orwell. Orwell, who wrote The Road to Wigan Pier. This is a long recording. In the same way that the liberal intolerance paradox is capable of flexing its muscle and the liberal intolerance paradox is capable of being resolved by a liberal democracy properly structured, flexing its sort of structural muscles. Then the society must, within its own structure, have this idea of ultimate transparency and people being able to ventilate issues and, being able to solve societal issues and things like that. And the reason why, a lot of people don't succeed in changing the world is because, essentially they go about it the wrong way, or there are institutional failings. But, you can privately contract to negotiate things and convince people through reason to change their actions or something like that. You can win electoral support and through manifesto try to regulate some kind of coordination in the private sphere. And between those two, you can legally challenge, let's say, obstacles that are unreasonably precipitate out of the woodwork, or that find themselves arbitrarily obstructing in unlawful ways, and the law is marked by a tremendous amount of developing rights based on principles in the common law. That there are a lot of substantive law rights. The law in my country comes from the Roman Dutch, which comes from the Roman law, which comes from an aristocracy, people that learned to enforce their will against other aristocrats fighting each other for getting things done, in the context of a republic. They really are broad, far-reaching things that you can get judges to preside over. Especially when you combine that with positive duties that the state holds from a constitution. I mean, there's so many failures in the current South African state that, if I were more established myself, I would think about making application against the public protector for failing in their duty, and also the Speaker of the House for failing in their duty to uphold the Constitution and protect the Constitution against constitutional damages by not ejecting people, if I was the public protector, I wouldn't even know what to do. I would have to create a general notice of constitutional crisis. Just that we're living right as it stands in a silent constitutional crisis, because no one is even talking about the constitutional crisis that we are in. So it's one thing to be in a constitutional crisis; it's another thing when everyone is silent on the matter, as if the Constitution isn't being betrayed. Anyway, I mean, this is what South Africa has. South Africa has a legal system that is head and shoulders above the rest. It's one of the newest constitutions, and it actually had the benefit of inheriting a legal tradition which actually did have a full substantive set of rights and a full substantive law. The Roman law was a complete law because it had to function as a republic. Senators suing each other, aristocrats suing each other. enforcing their rights in the court, and there's no way to get out of it. That each action has its requirements. If the requirements are met, the remedy is delivered. General actions, so all of the legal actions in all the particular procedures and things like that, they all have general requirements which all interact with principles and substantive rights. And there's a vast amount of philosophy that unifies all these things into a unified, codified system, so that it actually makes sense. That's the thing. That it actually makes sense when you reason through it all. It's sophisticated enough, and it's developed well enough. That there are enough remedies, that there are enough rights to support a complicated polity. So all of these things are capable of reinforcing liberal democracy. I mean, this is, obviously this law was developed for the aristocrats of the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. Well, the Roman Republic, which was also relative to the thing of the Republic, was also a territorial war-making machine or whatever, because things outside of it were not did not have rights. But we've liberalized rights, we've liberalized personality, legal subjectivity. Who is a legal subject? Slaves were not legal subjects. Now that has fallen away. There are no slaves under the Roman Dutch, under the canonized, the Christianized Roman Dutch law. So we have less things. There are less distinctions that we have to concern ourselves with, but all of these things are essentially the refinement of democratizing freedom and liberty and dignity. And it's very hard to democratize dignity. Because some people within their own right discard their own dignity. This is the fact of the matter. Some people are self-flagellating in terms of dignity. They destroy their own dignity. They throw it away. They're stuck in a paradox on the subject of dignity. So their dignity is trapped in a vortex. It's dead, it's atrophied, it's static, and they're busy using their dignity to do something else silly. And you can't really paint dignity on people that have thrown it away. So it's difficult to democratize dignity. It's trickier than democratizing freedom and liberty. But, so you preserve for people their rights. You preserve for people their potential. And that's the best way that you can guarantee them dignity. But you can't bestow dignity on people. That is probably, the leftist social justice warrior poison that, well, if people, as if the system itself should demand and guarantee and deliver dignity for people. Well, you can't do that for people that are throwing away their own dignity. And, there are paradoxes in this world. There are the liberal intolerance paradox. If you don't have a system that's right-headed enough to be able to deal with these problems and talk through them and get through them with some sensible conclusions and some workable pragmatics, you're just going to be shunted into some strange narrative every time someone produces some kind of strange siren call to some strange idealistic externalization of blame for someone who has destroyed their own dignity but are looking for a collective scapegoat. They want you to cry over someone's lost dignity when it's not lost. It's been surrendered. And you have to bootstrap people's responsibility for surrendering their own dignity. Otherwise, you don't even dignify them with agency. And they'll say, no, don't bootstrap responsibility on people. Make them eternal infants and look for a collective scapegoat. And fall into our narrative. Those are the kinds of charlatans you have to worry about in a liberal order. Sorry, this whole lecture, I guess, is something like trying to educate people on a stable liberal order, on the kind of liberal order that is capable of being preserved. And I think I've gone into some examples or exemplification on how measures could be taken to responsibly safeguard it. Obviously not in a way that guarantees it, because you can never guarantee anything like that. You can't assume. But you can only act as responsibly as possible. With a good faith and a good hope. Anyway, this is maybe an interesting recording for some people.